what we need to ultimately do is conduct randomized controlled trials, and we actually have many of them. In fact, in 2020, there was a meta-analysis of 41 randomized controlled trials on soy or soy isoflavone intake and hormone levels in men. And we saw that the soy isoflavones did not impact testosterone or estrogen levels, regardless of level of intake, including even higher levels of intake than we see typically in aging populations.
Alrighty, so Dr. Matthew Nagra, welcome to the podcast. I did want to kick this one off, man, like I usually do with most of our listeners, especially if they're coming from like a plant-based background, is kind of ask where the initial spark for, I guess, veganism or a plant-based diet came into your life. So how did that all kick off for you?
Yeah, so it started when I was pretty young, when I was a teenager, 14 or so. Maybe 15, I was working with a personal trainer. I was training for football. I also played a lot of other sports and martial arts, and I was doing a little bit of everything. And he really promoted sort of a plant-based diet. Now, not like 100% strict necessarily, but mostly plant-based. And I didn't really take him seriously for a long time until at one point he wanted me to record my food, food diary, as they're called. I record what I ate for a couple weeks. And when he said that, I knew my diet was so bad that he was going to see it and kick my ass in the gym or something, worse than he already does. So I thought, okay, I'm going to actually try to eat super clean for the next couple of weeks and kind of trick him or something like that. And by making some changes like ditching the dairy, reducing my meat intake, getting rid of a lot of the classic kind of ultra processed junk foods, I just started feeling better. I noticed I was losing some weight, which is something I'd struggled with as a kid. My skin was clearing up, felt like I was breathing a bit easier. I had a history of asthma. And so, I just thought, okay, maybe there's something to this and maybe I should learn more about it. And over the next couple of years, I just continued to read and learn and speak to people who had done it. I wasn't quite so adept at reading the primary scientific literature at that point. But at least getting what I could out of others. And, a couple years later, when I was at university, as I started to, be drinking on the weekends with my friends and eating cafeteria food and that kind of thing, I noticed that my health was declining again. I was kind of slipping the other way. And so there was a point where I just decided, like, you know what, I'm going cold turkey right now, overnight. And I did that in my second semester. It's been about 11 and a half years now.
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I don't think I've heard a story from someone who's kind of got to the point of eating plant-based via trying to impress somebody, especially like, just trying to change their diet so that your food diary looks a little bit more.
Yeah, I guess that is a unique one.
Yeah, it sure is. And so for you, that was, I guess for a lot of people, there is a point where you do have to kind of make that decision of, okay, well, this is it. I'm going to make that decision. Tomorrow's the day I start, and that's going to be my lifestyle going forward. And I think it is important to make that decision if that's of value to somebody that they want to go that full route. And so you were obviously transitioning before you got into the health industry. So I'd love to ask you what that background is like in terms of going through your studies as someone who was either transitioning or already transitioned to a plant-based diet.
Yeah, from a pretty young age, I was kind of interested in healthcare in general. I was interested in going somewhere in that sort of space, and seeing how much I did for myself, and eventually, actually, my dad had some cardiovascular issues as well, and seeing what he was able to do for himself with dietary change, really kind of prompted me to look for a way that I could not just focus on the medicine side of things, but also on the nutrition side. And it was actually one of my instructors in undergrad, so my undergraduate studies, who actually suggested that I shadow a couple of their naturopathic doctors, and I did. And I saw like, wow, I can prescribe medications, I can use nutrition in there. There's a lot of other tools in the toolkit that maybe I wasn't familiar with, and that's what sort of opened my eyes to it. And then, again, I went to some of the schools to visit and see what their classes were like and things. And ultimately, I thought it was a pretty good fit for me. So that's sort of how I got into that. And throughout the studies with my nutrition background and having, I'd say I knew a fair bit prior to actually even getting into that school. I'd say for the most part, the nutrition program was pretty good. It was very Mediterranean sort of focus, but there were definitely things where I was butting heads with maybe some of the instructors about. And obviously, I know a lot more about it now than I did even then. But for the most part, I actually thought the education was decent there on nutrition.
Yeah, that's cool. That's really good to hear. It's yeah, I think there is a lot of validity to that kind of Mediterranean style diet, and that is often promoted within a lot of academic circles. Um,
Mhm.
for the listeners, and even for myself, I'd love to understand what the real difference there is in terms of what um, like naturopathy covers, or what a naturopath does, um, as opposed to say a general medical doctor.
Yeah, and that answer is going to vary a little bit depending on where you are, what the regulation is like in the given state or province. And I know in Australia, at least, I hope I'm not mistaking this, but I don't think it's a regulated profession,
Right.
which means kind of like anyone can use the terms, and whether it's a 3 week course or a 4 year course. So I don't know if I can speak to that necessarily, but like here in British Columbia, which is one of the best areas to be in North America, we are primary care providers. Like I said, we can prescribe medications, we can send for blood tests, we can do a lot of that sort of stuff. But we are just, or we tend to be more lifestyle focused. We also have other tools in our toolkit, like maybe a little more knowledge around nutritional supplementation, and a bit more knowledge around potentially even herbal treatments, which I'd say there isn't a lot of evidence for a ton of them, but there are certain ones that might be beneficial there too.
Mhm.
And so it's just sort of a little bit of a different approach, I guess, in that what we prioritize or what we have a big, broader knowledge base of. But when it comes to like emergency medicine and stuff like that, like we aren't the
Yeah.
right person to go to. That's where I think we can complement each other pretty well. And I think one of the biggest benefits that I have is that I get to spend a lot of time with patients. Because it is in the private healthcare sector here. It's not covered under kind of the national insurance model. Rather than 10-15 minute visit, I can spend an hour with a patient, and oftentimes I'll catch things that were maybe missed. And that's not reflective of, oh, like the patient's doctor didn't do their due diligence. It's like, no, it's hard to capture all these things in a short period of time, and I can really dive deep, and sometimes I do catch things that maybe otherwise would have been missed. And again, that's sort of where that partnership comes in. I think anyway,
Yeah.
between the professions.
Yeah, I've probably always thought of naturopaths as, and like you said, I don't know quite, what the regulations are here, but as a little bit more airy fairy, like someone will go to a naturopath, they'll come away with a concoction of a whole bunch of different herbals that they're
Oh,
supposed to be taking,
yeah.
and that's going to solve all their problems. But I kind of like what you're describing to me in the sense that you can sit down with an individual and you can look at a lot of the other lifestyle factors that may be contributing to whatever they're wanting to
Mhm.
improve in their life.
And
Not
don't
just
get
like
me
here's
wrong.
a
Yeah.
herbal. Yeah.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, those issues certainly exist over here as well. It's
Mm,
definitely a problem. I see patients who maybe saw someone else prior and they're on a million things, and I just have to whittle it down to like, look, there isn't good evidence for that. There is for this, and then
right.
it happens here too, and it's certainly a problem that I would like to see fixed. But I wouldn't say it's reflective of what naturopathic medicine necessarily has to be or is. Right? That
Mm.
there are great practitioners, and there are some not so great practitioners, just like any other profession.
Yes, 100%. I guess that's a good sort of lead-in point to a question I had for you in regards to, I guess, reading research. You're someone who, if anyone goes onto your Instagram, they'll see that you obviously read a lot of research yourself. You're able to decipher that information. A lot of people, including myself, I don't love to read full research text because there's a lot of jargon in there. Where I'd rather read a research review where someone else can look at that raw data and then break it down a little bit more and go, hey, here's some clear takeaways. And so you're someone who does that quite well. How do you approach reading research and checking your bias along the way? I know that for myself, if I see a new study, I look at a lot more of the strength and hypertrophy research. But if I see a study come out regarding a plant-based diet versus an omnivorous diet in regards to strength training or health outcomes or anything like that, I'll jump on it because I know that because there's that inherent bias
Mhm.
there that I want my way of living to succeed and to be a valid way of approaching things. So how do you check that in yourself when you're reading a lot of the the research specifically on, human health outcomes, and even looking at, I guess, observational data where it's a little harder to tease out maybe what's going on.
Yeah, so there's a couple things. For one, I think you have to be aware of a potential bias. So, as somebody who you want to say is a part of a diet tribe, everyone uses that
Yeah,
term
yeah,
as
yeah.
someone who is vegan, right? I'm aware that that exists,
Hmm.
and then when I'm looking at something, I can, hopefully set that aside and look at it for what it is. I find so often people in the online nutrition space who maybe don't say eliminate any food groups altogether, they're very quick to point out that they aren't biased or they claim that they are not biased. That is garbage. Everybody has a bias. If you prefer the sort of moderation approach or a little bit of everything, that's your bias.
Right.
So anything that suggests that a given food that maybe you like red meat or whatever, is harmful, you're going to be less likely to favor that. And I see this in the fitness community a lot with animal protein. It's like,
Hmm.
man, we have so much outcome based research at this point, looking at even diets where most of the protein's coming from whole foods, yet we don't see a significant difference between animal and plant protein. Like, give it up already. It's kind of you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
but they hold on to it, and they're always trying to find ways to perform like these mental gymnastics. And I see the same thing with red meat and like say cardiovascular outcomes. So
Mm.
that's one, is just understanding that the bias is there and setting it aside. Second is I try to I don't just read the abstracts. Like I dive into the methodology for any type of study, whether it's favoring a plant-based diet or whether it's not. Now, in cases where maybe a study contradicts our priors, like it contradicts what we know about the topic already,
Hmm.
you want to find the explanation for that. It's not like, oh, all of a sudden everything we knew before was wrong, even though the headlines will often say that. You have to understand, well, why is it? What is it maybe about the characteristics of the population? Or maybe it's the doses. Like we'll talk about some soy research in a little bit, but when you look at American populations, you're comparing a serving a month to maybe a serving a week. And of course, you're not going to see much benefit versus in Asian populations where they're having it almost daily or up to almost daily.
Yeah.
So when there are results that contradict the consensus or prior knowledge on a topic, it's almost always explainable. I've rarely seen cases where it's not explainable by other factors. And so I look at evidence through that lens as well. And if it does contradict consensus, then I really want to dive extra deep into that
Mm.
paper and kind of see what's going on. And in cases where maybe it's a topic outside of my wheelhouse that I'm not as good at, I consult with other experts in the field. I do that all the time. We don't have to pretend to know everything. We can't know everything.
Yeah.
And that's something too. I find that there are a lot of people who make claims outside of maybe their specialty or whatever their area of focus is, and they're just very hesitant to acknowledge when maybe they don't have that knowledge base or maybe they're wrong about something. It's like it's okay to consult others or to look at other opinions. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, I agree. I think if you can follow somebody or listen to somebody that is able to say I don't know in a certain situation, then they're probably someone who's going to be of value to you long term, because they're not someone who's just going to, they're not a complete zealot to a specific ideal where they will just come up with some kind of mechanism off the top of their brain as to why something's happening when they really don't know. They just want to sound smart, right? So if they can
Mm-hmm.
say I don't know, then they're probably someone worth following. But I think you bring up a good point in regards to potentially the idea of cherry picking studies. People probably need to realize that there are studies that can be done in a questionable manner, or even just the way that they have kind of synthesized the data from a study may have been done in a weird way, or whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm.
So there can be some outcomes in studies that are like you said, they're like, oh well, that's contrary to the huge amount of data we have before this on this topic. So maybe we should look deeper into the mechanisms of this and why this is, or how they've analyzed this data. But, in saying that, someone can take that one study and go, well, now all of that other stuff is refuted because this study says something's different. And that's where that idea of, I guess, cherry picking comes in, where you
Mm-hmm.
pick one study, it's not in congruence with the rest of the data on a topic, and now you're promoting that as the truth. So I think that's probably a big one to bring up for people as well, is just to go, okay, cool, like you can cite one study, but does it line up with the rest of the data on a particular subject?
Yeah, 100%. And actually, I realized I didn't answer your question about observational research either.
Right.
So like when it comes to observational research or epidemiology, for people listening who maybe aren't familiar, that's sort of when you're looking at, the a large population, or typically a large population. They don't have to be large, but typically for, say, prospective cohorts or something, we're looking at a large population followed for a period of time, and you're looking at those who, say, consume more red meat versus those who consume less, and do they have a higher rate of cardiovascular disease over that, say, 10, 15, 20-year period. And how we can tease out whether or not that variable, say red meat intake, is the variable that is potentially causing that outcome or contributing to that outcome, is we perform what are called statistical adjustments. So you want to also look at other variables that could be related to cardiovascular disease. So level of physical activity, potentially things like body weight or history of diabetes, smoking status, all of these other variables, and you adjust for them. And in its simplest term, the simplest way to explain that would be that you level the playing field. So you're really trying to compare people who smoke a similar amount, who exercise a similar amount, who have similar levels of income, and so that the variable of interest is that red meat, the variable that's different between them. Now, there are complex ways of doing this that might be beyond the scope of this discussion. I mean, you could tell me, but really, that's the goal. That's the goal of what they're trying to do. And so these researchers, they're smart. They know what they're doing most of the time. And so they perform those sorts of analyses so we can try to get to that variable. And I wouldn't say that one single study is going to prove cause and effect, but when you have the same results replicated across populations, across age groups, across with a similar, say, dose response, so a similar amount of red meat consumption contributing, you can be pretty confident about that when you pair it, especially with, say, randomized controlled trials looking at red meat intake and cardiovascular risk factors. Like you're looking at all the data together. You're not just looking at any single isolated study.
Yeah, no, I love that. And it kind of leads in nicely to our discussion on soy, because I guess there's actually a stack load of data on soy that I think people are probably unaware of, and there's various meta-analyses on soy, which is I guess a combination of a whole bunch of studies brought together and kind of analyzed in a way that we have some clear outcomes or some clear takeaways. And I haven't really discussed soy on this podcast, since probably episode 2 when I had a dietitian on. We had a little chat about soy and some of the myths around it. And I don't quite often see a lot of the claims or the myths touted in my circles now, because I don't surround myself with those people. But I know that those myths and claims are still pretty prevalent in the general population. I'm wondering if you have seen much of it these days, because of the circles that you are I guess in online, but maybe you see it with some of the people you work with in person around some of the potential claims that you've heard around the detriments of soy in human health.
Oh yeah, I see it in my practice all the time. I'll be talking about, say, increase in soy consumption for somebody with elevated LDL cholesterol, cardiovascular risk factors, because it's beneficial in that case. And I'll often be met with, oh, but I thought soy was bad. Or like I'll have patients who's even oncologists, so they're breast cancer survivors, whose oncologists are recommending they avoid soy. And it's like we actually have data on survival with soy intake, and higher soy intake associated with better survival in breast cancer survivors. Right. So it's like, it's just a complete misrepresentation of the research, but it's maybe not their fault that they aren't familiar with it if it's not being taught to them, right? And so, yeah, so I see it all the time, and it's constantly a topic I have to debunk. And like we were talking about, I did a 2-episode, 3-hour marathon with Simon Hill on the topic too. It's just like it's something that I'm always trying to hammer.
Yeah, and I think that the narratives will slowly change over time, I'm sure. As more of these these episodes and different people are promoting it. But I guess a question I'd love to hear your thoughts on is, where do you think some of these narratives originated from? If it's across the board in general population, especially in the Western world, that soy is a problem for whatever reason, whatever claim they have, whether it's to do with hormone health or whether it's to do with cancer. Or whether it's to do with the way it's processed, or even the way that its effects on climate change. What do you think, especially some of the claims around human health and its negative effects, have actually originated from?
So why or when it started, I'm not sure. But where the information often comes from, I'd say is typically a couple places. So there's research on rodents who are fed not even soy most of the time, but isolated soy isoflavones, which are those estrogen-like compounds that are found in soy. And we'll get into those in a minute here, but
Yeah.
basically they're isolated high amounts of those phytoestrogens and they're fed them, sometimes even injected with them, and they run into problems. Couple issues there. We aren't rodents, and the translation of animal research into human outcomes is very poor. If something works or is harmful in an animal model, chances are it's not going to be the same in humans based on what we know. That translation rate is very poor, so it doesn't tell us a lot. Second, there are a couple isolated case studies. So these are sort of like anecdotes that have been published where you follow an individual and you give kind of a detailed history for them, and you'll see a couple where some men were having almost all soy diets essentially, and they may have run into issues. One of them, I believe, was erectile dysfunction. Another one noted some breast growth, so gynecomastia. We can't, and actually they say in there, we can't determine cause and effect. We can't say for certain that the soy caused those issues, but hey, potentially they're having a ton of soy and they're having these issues.
Yeah.
Might be a link. What we need to ultimately do is conduct randomized controlled trials, and we actually have many of them. In fact, in 2020, there was a meta-analysis of 41 randomized controlled trials on soy or soy isoflavone intake and hormone levels in men. And we saw that the soy isoflavones did not impact testosterone or estrogen levels, regardless of level of intake, including even higher levels of intake than we see typically in Asian populations. And then for women, there's a meta-analysis. I believe the most recent one was going back to about 2009 now, 47 trials. And they found that, again, pretty high doses of soy intake did not actually significantly impact estrogen or testosterone values overall. So again, when we're actually testing these compounds in humans, it doesn't seem like it's a concern from a hormone perspective. And that might be because these phytoestrogens, they work differently than estrogen. They aren't the same as our own human estrogens or even the estrogens that you'll find in animal products, which are mammalian estrogens. They are similar in shape to our own estrogens, so they can bind to some of the same receptors, but they are much, much, much weaker, like up to 1/1000th the strength of our own estrogens. And they preferentially bind certain types of receptors in our body that have specific actions that can actually help modulate the estrogen response. So if you're having a very pro-estrogenic response, it can actually dampen that. Where if you're having say a low estrogenic response, you're not getting enough of that estrogenic response, it can actually promote it, like in bone tissue, for example, where we want an estrogenic response to help with bone mineral density. So it actually works both ways and tends to be beneficial in that case.
Yeah. So I'd love to dive a little deeper into that, especially the hormone side of things. I think that's probably the most common one that comes up is and even I've had this from people that, I have in my life is when I, started transitioning to eating more soy and a vegan diet, there was these claims of like, watch out, but you don't want to have these feminizing effects. So when we look at that meta-analysis where you say, hey, look, regardless of dose, there was no real effects on especially on the male hormones. Yet we do have some of those case studies where there was that one where that guy was eating however many, like 12 servings a day of soy or whatever it was. It was a huge amount.
That was the lower amount of the two, but yeah.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. So a large amount of soy, and there were some effects there. So how do we I guess look between those two and go, what is the discrepancy here? Like, what was the dosage in some of those meta-analysis studies where you said, hey, even if it was a high dose, there wasn't any effects? Do you have any idea of what the dosage was there and like where maybe the cutoff is?
Yeah, so the dosages that we saw, well, for starters, actually talking about the case studies, we don't know that there was a cause and effect relationship there. We need to be very clear. Okay. Just like say the claimed to be the world's oldest man a couple years ago, died at 118. Freddie Blum was his name, and he smoked every day. Doesn't mean that smoking's fine, right? Yeah. Even if he smoked in moderation, doesn't mean that that's fine. So drawing that sort of cause and effect relationship is very difficult in those cases, and in fact can't really be done.
Yeah.
But let's even assuming that is correct. The meta-analysis, the one on men, had doses up to about 40 grams of soy protein and over 100 milligrams of isoflavones, the phytoestrogens. And to give you kind of an idea of what that might look like, so a cup of soy milk or 100 grams of tofu is about that 20 to 25 milligram of isoflavone mark.
Okay.
Tempeh around 35 milligrams, soy protein isolate a little under 20. So you're looking at 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe even servings every day, like daily, and that's a fair bit in and of itself. Not that I personally wouldn't even be concerned going higher than that, to be honest. But that is, that's I'd say a fair amount for the average person to be consuming anyway.
And that was the dosage that was seen as to be fine in these
Yeah.
studies.
So what they did what's called a subgroup analysis. So they looked at different doses of, say, isoflavone intake. So they separated into studies where the dose was over 100 milligrams, and then studies where it's under 100 milligrams, and there might have been even a lower one. I can't recall. And so even in the highest one, which is that over 100 milligram dose, which would be at least 4 or 5 cups of soy milk a day, or 4 or 500 gram servings of tofu a day. Even if soy intake is that high, or isoflavone intake is that high, there wasn't a significant impact. And if anything, funny enough, there was a non-statistically significant increase in testosterone. So it's like the opposite of what people would claim anyway.
Yeah.
So again, I don't see any good reason to be concerned about it.
Yeah, cool. Do you see any reason why, I guess, a Western population would have because I don't know if these studies, what populations they were done on, but we know that Asian populations have been consuming soy for thousands of years now. And is there anything to say, or if you ever thought about the idea that maybe Asian populations can tolerate a higher dose of isoflavones than, say, a Western population who generally don't consume a lot of soy, or like you're saying, they consume it like once a month or whatever?
Yeah, so if I recall correctly, they actually subgrouped by geographic location as well, and it didn't seem to make a difference. But even then, if we were to look at, say, cohort studies, observational research on different populations, at worst, we see a neutral impact of soy consumption in Western populations, like at worst. And that's,
Right.
again, because they eat such a small amount, right? To have the benefits of soy intake, you need to eat higher amounts. Now, there is speculation as to why, say, in Asian populations, they might benefit even more beyond just eating more of it. And that's because they might have certain microbes in their gut that break down some of the soy and soy isoflavones into certain compounds called equal, which might have certain benefits. But if that has an impact, I suspect it's a relatively modest impact compared to just what soy in general would do for even Western populations. So I don't think there's reason to believe that in Western populations they wouldn't also benefit from having more, and I see zero reason to think that in Western populations there'd actually be harm to consuming it.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, it's definitely something that I think, starting to gain some traction in Western populations as more soy foods, and I think that's going to only increase as more people sort of shift towards more plant-based eating. So that's really good to see, and good to hear that it's going to be beneficial for us. I guess another claim that is often thrown around is the effects on cancer risk, and specifically breast cancer risk. Have you seen any data on this, and do you feel there is any risk associated with soy consumption and any forms of cancer?
Yeah, so we have plenty of research on soy consumption and breast cancer risk. So it's just to run through some of the notes that I have here. 2013 meta-analysis of observational research found that isoflavone range or higher soy consumption, particularly in Asian populations, was associated with better outcomes for breast cancer risk. But we didn't see as much of a benefit or any real benefit in the Western populations. And that's because when you look at the range of intakes, even the highest consumers in the Western populations were eating less than the lowest consumers in Asian populations.
Wow.
So the contrast in intake was tiny, and you're not going to see, it's like, again, if we're trying to look at, risk associated with smoking, and you compare someone smoking, 5 cigarettes a day to 6 cigarettes a day, you're just not going to see a difference,
Yes.
right? And so it's the same kind of thing. Now, in 2019, there was another great meta-analysis looking at soy intake, and they found that each 10 milligram of isoflavone intake was associated with a 3% lower breast cancer risk. And if we look specifically at tofu, about it would be about a half a serving of tofu a day was associated with a modest decrease. And then obviously higher intakes would lead to a greater decrease in risk. In fact, each 10 grams of tofu consumed is associated with a 10% lower risk in what are called case control studies. And then even for breast cancer survival, as I kind of mentioned earlier, those who have breast cancer or previously battled breast cancer tend to actually have higher survival rates if they consume more soy compared to those who consume less. So across the board, we're seeing benefit, or in Western populations, at worst, we're seeing relatively neutral impact, but that's largely probably because they just aren't consuming very much. So it's pretty clear there. And then in men, we see data on prostate cancer, also suggesting that higher soy consumption may reduce prostate cancer risk. And according to an umbrella review, which is sort of a review of meta-analyses, in this case, 114 different meta-analyses,
wow,
soy consumption was associated with a lower risk of ovarian cancer, prostate, colorectal, endometrial, lung, stomach, I think maybe a couple other cancers. And the only negative that they found was that miso soup intake specifically was associated with a higher risk of stomach cancer, but that's likely due to the fact that it's high in sodium. And high sodium intake is associated with higher stomach cancer risk. So it wasn't necessarily the soy per se, it was probably all the salt that's in there.
Yeah. Yeah, that probably comes back to like a good point of like when you look at foods, it's not always like specifically the food, but also how it is administered. How is it processed? How are you consuming that food? And I'd love to touch on some of that in a moment in regards to soy and processing. But probably one of the other big points in regards to soy that does come up is in relation to cardiovascular disease, or at least it's something maybe we should touch on. I think you've mentioned in the past in regards to some of the benefits of soy in regards to cardiovascular disease risk. What do you have to say on that, and what are some of the maybe the mechanisms around why soy would actually be beneficial for reducing cardiovascular disease risk?
Yeah, so again, going to a meta-analysis of randomized trials that we have, soy protein itself. So if you're taking soy protein in the form of a supplement or soy milk, so these are going to be obviously without all the fiber and everything,
Right.
even then, soy protein can reduce LDL cholesterol values, which is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. And this meta-analysis in particular found that there was about a 3.2% reduction in LDL cholesterol levels, which is just under 5 milligrams per deciliter. I don't know what units you use in Australia, whether it's millimoles per liter or milligrams per deciliter.
Yeah, I think it's milligrams. Yeah.
Okay. So Canada actually uses the other ones, but anyways, I'll give you the milligrams per deciliter there. And the median dose, so kind of middle of the road, was about 25 grams. So that's, if you were to take a soy protein isolate, that's like a scoop, typically, is around there for about 6 weeks. And that was, again, for pretty well isolated soy protein. It wasn't even for, soy foods with more fiber that can also have the benefits for, say, cardiovascular risk or LDL values, because fiber can bind some of the cholesterol in our gut and help excrete it. And now, so what are the mechanisms here? Although this trial doesn't totally speak to that, one of the benefits would be replacing saturated fat and cholesterol with soy protein sources. So saturated fat raises LDL, you replace meat or something like that with tofu, you're getting rid of the saturated fat, or drastically reducing the saturated fat, you're getting rid of the cholesterol. That in and of itself is going to be beneficial. Also, when we break down and digest soy protein, some of the short chains of amino acids that are produced there during digestion might actually increase LDL receptor activity, which is, on our cells, we have, or especially liver cells, we have these receptors that pull LDL out of the bloodstream. And so you can actually potentially upregulate those receptors. So if you have more of them, you're pulling more LDL out of the bloodstream, therefore dropping your LDL values, which you don't want in the blood, right? You want it as low as possible. And then there are, as far as cardiovascular risk, some evidence around blood pressure, although that's not necessarily related to LDL cholesterol, potentially reducing that as well. And there's a lot of speculation to be had about other mechanisms. Like I don't think we've totally figured it out, but what we do see is that it reduces LDL values, and again, higher soy consumption is associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular events in the observational research that we have. And a 2017 meta-analysis found that high consumption is associated with a 16% lower risk of cardiovascular disease compared to lower consumption. And there was a fairly recent prospective cohort from China with nearly 100,000 Chinese adults ages 40 and up, and they had a good range of intakes. And again, high consumption was associated with a 14% lower risk of cardiovascular disease and actually a 17% lower risk of all-cause mortality, which is total risk of dying during this study period, compared to those consuming the least. So I mean, the data is pretty consistent there as well.
Yeah, cool. I mean, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like, soy pretty much is a bit of a slam dunk across the board for most populations to be consuming. And even I was listening to a podcast recently around even soy consumption for ladies transitioning through the menopause phase, and its benefits on helping reduce hot flashes and things like that. So even the effects of menopause can be somewhat dampened by an increased consumption of soy as well. So I think there's some real big benefits to be had from upregulating soy in somebody's diet for various health outcomes here. Are there any sort of special circumstances that you've come across that somebody may need to avoid soy? I mean, I know there are certain people that I've worked with in the past that have, for whatever reason, been requested not to consume soy by their doctor, whether it's like, a true intolerance or some other complication there. Is there anything that you've seen that some people may actually have to avoid soy, or maybe they have to reduce the total total dose slightly?
Well, in cases of allergy, of course, you shouldn't be eating something that you're allergic to. But in cases of intolerances, that could be another one. Now, intolerances are really tough to diagnose. Like, it's really hard to diagnose and pinpoint exactly what the problem is. But if you are, end up being quite confident that it is soy, and you've tried eliminating it and reintroducing it, and it bugs you or upsets your stomach in some way, then yeah, of course, that would be another reason too. Otherwise, honestly, I don't really see any major reason for anyone to avoid soy. I just haven't really seen any convincing data that it's one of the most nutritious, if not the most nutritious legume, and it's consistently associated with good health outcomes. So I just don't see a reason.
Yeah, awesome. And I guess if someone did, for allergy's sake, have to just continue consuming soy, it's like, well, there's many other legumes that you could consume instead, and still get some really great benefits from those products as well. So the one of the other things I wanted to touch on was, there are a lot of people that will say, okay, great, well, soy seems to be great for human health, and all these outcomes we've just mentioned. But some of these soy products are super processed, and I don't want to consume processed foods. They're going to be, detrimental to my health. I don't want to consume tofu that's been processed. I don't want to consume soy milk, that's been processed. And then especially, and I'll term those very minimally processed foods. But then if we look at, foods such as a lot of the mock meats that we see now in supermarkets that do have soy in them, there's another aspect that someone would go, okay, no, well, I'm not going to consume mock meats because they are a processed variety of food, and that is harmful for human health. So what would you say to that? And are there any sort of processed foods or soy processed foods that we should be mindful of?
So just starting with the last question, actually, things to be mindful of isn't necessarily the soy itself, but if you're getting into like really high sodium contents, or you're having some mock meats that are loaded with coconut oil or something, the high saturated fat content, something to look out for. So when it comes to those sort of products, I do usually look at sodium content, and I look at saturated fat content first and foremost. But outside of that, just because something's processed doesn't make it unhealthy. And in fact, processing can be a benefit in a lot of cases. If we think about, say, plant-based milks, whether it be soy milk or another plant-based milk, I mean, we have all the fortification. They're a fantastic source of calcium, can be a source of B12, vitamin D. Without the processing of that, we wouldn't have it. Calcium would be a bigger problem for people eating plant-based diets, for sure. If we look at like vinegar is a healthy thing to consume. Might help with vasodilation, does all sorts of things, yet it's processed. We look at olive oil, often touted as a health food. Maybe some people in the plant-based community not so much, but super well researched and associated with great health outcomes across the board, and it's processed. Just because something's processed doesn't make it unhealthy. And just because something's unprocessed doesn't make it healthy. Again, red meat, unprocessed, associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease, colorectal cancer, and even all-cause mortality.
Yeah.
I mean, what would you take in that case? Remove labels altogether, and just as a thought experiment, you have food A, zero processing as nature intended, but you live a shorter life. Food B, processed, better nutrition, lower risk of disease, you live a longer life. What do you choose? I mean, if processing was the problem, you would pick food A, which leads to a shorter life, right? So clearly, it's not the problem when you put it that way.
Yeah.
And so that's just something to think about. I don't think the fact that something's processed is the issue. And when we look at like tofu, I think it's one of the greatest benefits, especially for athletes. When you've removed some of the fiber, you've processed it down, the protein's more bioavailable, you've got a higher caloric density, which is great for, if you're trying to hit a certain calorie target. And if you're trying to rely on, say, edamame for that, it might be a lot more challenging to get to that number or to get to that amount. So yeah, I don't see that as a really good argument. And I think it leads to fear around things that could actually be really beneficial.
Yeah, that's a great point. Actually, that last point you brought up is in regards to, if there is an athlete who is trying to, for example, increase protein intake, but they're afraid of a processed food, they find it very hard to consume enough total, whole foods, even minimally processed foods such as even tofu and tempeh and things like that. If they're a larger individual, they're probably going to want to use a protein powder at some point to ramp that
Yeah.
up a little bit. So that is an ultra processed food by all classifications. But that doesn't, again, it's about stripping away these labels. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be harmful to human health, and potentially it's even going to be beneficial if there's been things, if that product's been fortified with other nutrients such as as you mentioned, calcium, B12. Sometimes I see protein powders fortified with things like iron. So
Mm-hmm.
these things can be really beneficial for us as well. Now, all this being said, what would be some typical recommendations you would give to the people that you work with, your own clients, or even people that just follow you in regards to, what are some good soy foods that people should be including, and what kind of dosages should they be looking at on a daily basis that would be, appropriate for somebody?
Well, for types of foods, like I love tofu. I love smoked tofu. I make sandwiches with it all the time. Don't even have to do anything.
Tofu? Or you just buy smoke?
So it's bought. I don't know if you don't have that where you are, but yeah. So it's like smoked and it's hard. It's like really super firm and it's already flavored. Tastes so good. So I'm sorry you don't have that, but
we're a little.
I love using. Yeah, I love using that on sandwiches. Or if I'm using plain tofu, I'll just like pan fry it with some like hot sauce and spices and put that on a sandwich or something. So I love tofu. I use it in a whole variety of ways. Tempeh's good. I feel like I don't eat it that much, but I do enjoy it when I do, and it's pretty widely available. Edamame is obviously available everywhere, although it's typically loaded with a whole lot of salt when you do purchase it anywhere. Soy milk is my milk of choice. It is the most nutritious one, and it's actually, I don't know over there, but over here is the only plant milk that is recommended for kids because of its nutrient profile.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And then one that I got Simon to order like a massive box of was soy curls.
Okay.
I don't know if you've ever had those or heard of them.
Heard those, no.
Oh, I love them. They're very sort of chicken-esque in texture, and it's just soy. It's just ground dried soy is all it is. But they're in these chunks, and you soak it in water, and it gets a very like meaty texture, and then you just cook it up with whatever sauce or spices or whatever you want.
Yeah.
And it's great on like stir fries or whatever. So that's one. And TVP, textured vegetable protein, is a similar idea and very, very high protein. In fact, per calorie, it rivals even extra lean meats.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an excellent protein source to choose from. And those would be some of the main ones, but I know there are a lot of other options as well. As far as dosages, I know you mentioned, I'm not concerned, to be honest. I'm just really not. I don't see any reason to be concerned about it. I would say once soy intake gets to a point that it's crowding out other things and you're not getting your fruits or vegetables or other legumes or your whole grains, your nuts and seeds, if you're totally crowding out some of those food groups, then you're definitely having too much, right? You want to have a little bit of all of that. But I'm not worried, or I wouldn't be worried if you're having one serving a day, or if you're having 3 servings a day or whatever. It's just typically not a concern. Obviously, if there are any people listening with any health concerns or conditions that they're working on, speak with your healthcare provider for sure. Definitely let them know if you're making any big changes to your diet. But otherwise, I just don't see research suggesting that it's a concern. Outside of, actually, maybe we should touch on this. If you have hypothyroidism and you're taking medication for that, like Synthroid would be a common one, definitely don't want to take those at the same time as you're eating soy. In fact, should be on an empty stomach most of the time, and or all the time. And you want to make sure that your iodine intake is adequate. The only time that soy consumption seems to be a problem with regard to thyroid health is if iodine intake is not adequate. So that's definitely another thing to consider.
Yeah, that's actually an interesting point, because I guess in this episode we've touched a little bit on salt intake a couple of times here in regards to, okay, maybe we want to, don't have too many foods that are really, really laden with a whole bunch of extra salt. And generally that's going to mean, hey, cool, we're going to steer away from really ultra processed foods. But there's a certain amount of salt, especially if you're, like in places like New Zealand, it's probably the same in Canada and stuff like that, where salt, a lot of the table salt is fortified with iodine. There is a certain amount that's probably going to be essential for human health. I know that there is this kind of inverse U association with salt, in the terms that, like, too little is not great for health. Too much is probably also not great for health. What would you be your recommendations around salt for people? Just as a little dovetail here.
Yeah, I say the U or the J shaped relationship might be due to some confounding. It's really hard to tease out that lower end. So I don't know that people need to necessarily focus on including salt. I wouldn't say the evidence is super clear there, at least in my view.
Okay.
But when it comes to iodine intake, yeah, having a bit of salt is, unless you have high blood pressure, you're trying to lower that or something. I don't see a big problem with that. There aren't a lot of contraindications, maybe up with certain kidney issues there, but for most healthy individuals, I don't see a big concern. And then the other option are low sodium salt alternatives. Like, there are potassium based salts that you can use that you can also get iodized, and that's actually what I use. And so I'll use that in my prep, and it'll taste like salt, but it's much lower in sodium and actually much higher in potassium, and just ultimately a bit better for you. So that's another option too. But definitely looking at iodine sources like that, or potentially a supplement, or even seaweeds aren't the best source, because the iodine content can be very variable depending on the source and everything. So it's a little less clear there, and I'd be a little hesitant to rely on that. But otherwise, a salt or salt alternative is pretty good.
Okay, cool. Yeah, great. Well, I think we've covered a whole bunch here, and really given a nice, clear picture for people. And hopefully they'll want to share this one with some friends and family members, maybe that are a little confused around soy consumption, and just kind of put them at ease that it's going to be a fine thing to include in their diet in various amounts, and specifically for athletes and people who wanting to jack up protein a little bit. Adding in some soy in various forms is going to be really beneficial for your protein intake as well. As we sort of finish up here, I love to ask, because you mentioned before around, you doing some personal training, and you were doing football, I believe. What does fitness look like for you these days?
So I play soccer. That's been my main sport my whole life. When I said football earlier, I meant American football.
Okay, cool.
But soccer is something I've played my whole life. That's my main sport. Once I got into university and then into career, I couldn't do everything anymore.
Yeah.
So that's the one that stuck. I also lift weights probably about 4 times a week, and I do some sort of cardiovascular activity, cycling, running on the other days. So I'm doing something every day, pretty much here. And I've done previously a lot of martial arts like jiu-jitsu, taekwondo, boxing, and so on. And I do like to still do that with some friends every now and then. We have a little group that does sometimes, but it's kind of fallen to the wayside a little bit.
Yeah. No, that's super cool. It's always great to hear, someone who is in the health industry, but also, out there doing a bit of training as well, and really benefiting from that sort of things. Getting the benefits from the diet and from the exercise too. One of the things I love to finish off, and I've sort of started doing this recently, is finish off with a question for you in regards to a recommendation. So for the listeners, what is one thing you're digging right now and that you think maybe other people would enjoy as well? This could be like anything from a book or a band you're listening to or a new favorite food, anything you like. What are you into right now?
Oh man, so it's not just even nutrition, hey?
No,
So a
not
little
at all.
bit,
Not at all.
whatever
Give
I
us
want.
anything. Yeah, man. Because I think you know, I love hearing what other people are digging and what they're into, and maybe then I can go check it out as well and find something that I really love.
All right. So I also a musician. I played guitar for a long time, and I had my amp was broken for like months, and so it just got fixed. So I've been playing a ton of guitar
Awesome.
lately. Actually, just playing up until about a minute before this call. So I play a lot of like AC/DC, so Australian band AC/DC, and then Def Leppard. They're a couple of my favorites. So I've been messing around with that a lot.
Fantastic. So guitars is back on the agenda for you. I love it.
Yeah.
That's awesome, mate. And to finish up here, mate, what are you working on this year? Is there anything you want to promote, or do you want to just link your handles for the people so they can check you out?
Working on some stuff, maybe not super ready to announce just yet, but stay tuned, I guess.
Totally.
But definitely, you follow me on social media. I do most of my content on Instagram, so just at dr.matthewnagra. Obviously, you can link that for them. Also on Twitter, on Facebook, on TikTok now. That's a more recent thing. But honestly, it ends up being just my Instagram content going across.
Yeah. How do you find the difference in how it's received over there? Is it different?
Oh, the comments are ridiculous. Like on TikTok, people will they'll make such strong claims about everything, and I just respond with, "Did you read the study?" Because it's clear they didn't. Like the last stuff or criticize things that are clearly answered in the study. And I'll keep responding with that because it gets really annoying. But yeah, so I mean that happens on Instagram too, but I feel like it's the percentage of comments that are like that is just way higher on TikTok.
It's crazy.
I think this
deal with it.
I think there's a big there has to be a big carnivore community on TikTok or something. Right. Like that's what it feels like to me.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is I'd say my website, drmatthewnagra.com. I post, sometimes larger articles. I also link all my podcast appearances there. So I'll link this one there as well.
Yeah.
And people can check out past podcasts I've been on, things like that too.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's awesome. I'll link all that for everybody and they can check you out. And yeah, I love the content that you're putting out. It's very clear, to the point, and with some actionable sort of take homes for people, which I really appreciate. So we need more of that good stuff out there. So good on you. Thanks for coming on the episode, mate. Thanks for chatting through this with me. We'll catch you again soon.
Thanks.
All right, guys, there you have it. Soy debunked. Overwhelmingly, soy seems to be beneficial for a whole bunch of human health outcomes and seems to be beneficial no matter what form you take it in. If you're someone who generally avoids processed foods, you can take some of the topics we discussed around processed foods from this episode and try to implement that into your dietary practices as well. Obviously, a diet that is predominantly processed foods is not going to be beneficial for human health, but one that includes some processing and especially some minimally processed foods that are generally fortified with beneficial nutrients such as iron, such as fiber, such as calcium is going to be a real benefit to your health. So with that being said, soy foods are definitely on the menu. Take a look at including tofu, tempeh, textured vegetable protein, edamame beans, even some protein powders that include soy isolate should be fine, protein bars, and even some of your mock meat varieties that you'll find at supermarkets should be fine as well. Just having a look, as we mentioned in this podcast, at the total saturated fat content and the sodium content of those foods. And as a final point here, just remembering that soy foods are a complete protein, meaning they contain all 9 essential amino acids, and they're a great option for building lean muscle tissue and promoting recovery from training. All right, that is it. I hope you enjoyed it. Please share it with a friend. Share it with someone who needs to know some info about soy. They need to understand the intricacies and maybe cross off some of those myths that have been perpetuated for far too long. Okay, that's it. I'm Jackson Burden. This is the Vegan Body Coach Podcast, and we'll see you in the next one. Plant friends.